There is something really fascinating about the soundtrack of Obsession. You've got this composer, right? He's named Burwell, and he basically comes out of nowhere with his first feature score. And somehow he creates one of the most memorable soundtracks in horror in recent years. So in this video I want to talk about three things: the music itself, and why it works so well, how the music connects to the story, which is one of the most refreshing tales we have had in the last couple years, and how it manages to differ itself from the rest, and the composer behind it all, Burwell, and how he managed to create such an amazing soundtrack while it being his first. Let's get into it. One of the smartest things about the Obsession soundtrack is how restrained it is. A lot of modern horror movies rely heavily on a giant orchestral scores, aggressive sound design, or non-stop tension in music that's always trying to tell you when to be scared. But Obsession takes a very different approach. The soundtrack is patient. It's built around atmosphere more than a shock. What makes it so well is that the music doesn't just try to scare you. Instead, it captures the emotional core of the movie, the obsession itself. At first, the soundtrack makes Obsession feel beautiful, almost euphoric. The synthesizers are dreamy. The melodies, they feel nostalgic, even romantic at point. It's like you're trapped inside this perfect fantasy, right? But slowly, almost without noticing, the music starts to decay, and certain notes just feel slightly wrong. And those almost dreamy textures that feel closer to a memory than a traditional horror soundtrack. And honestly, for long stretches of the movie, the music barely sounds threatening. And that's important, because both the movie and the soundtrack, the music, it's about becoming trapped in your own desires. The soundtrack reflects that perfectly. The music doesn't attack the audience immediately. The same thing goes for the movie plot. There aren't some cheap jump scares in it. It's a slow burn. Same goes with the music. It slowly reveals itself. And that makes the ending, the payoff, that much more satisfying. Early tracks like Love Is in the Air are almost comforting at first listen. There's this emotional sincerity to them that makes the fantasy feel almost believable. You understand why the characters want to stay inside that emotional state. But then Burwell starts slowly altering things. And what's interesting is how subtle it is. Sometimes it's just a slightly distorted synth in the background. Sometimes a melody repeats too many times. Sometimes a note feels slightly out of place. Even though you might not notice it, subconsciously it creates this feeling that something isn't quite right, even before the movie fully reveals it. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about the soundtrack, the subtlety, and how it trusts the audience to piece things together. It doesn't constantly scream, "This is scary." Instead, it lets the discomfort slowly grow over time. And the sound design also plays a huge role in that. There is a lot of empty space in the soundtrack, right? Silence gets used constantly. You'll have scenes that have almost no soundtrack at all. Just those faint ambient textures humming underneath everything else. And that restraint makes the tense moments hit that much harder. Because the soundtrack understands that horror is often much more effective when it feels unfinished. Like something is missing. The soundtrack also has this nostalgic feel to it, which makes it emotionally unique compared to most horror scores. A lot of people compared it to older psychological horror games like Silent Hill 2, and I completely see that resemblance. There is this foggy, dreamlike sadness running through the whole soundtrack. Even in its warmest moments, there is still this underlying melancholy in the background. And I think that emotional contradiction stick in people's minds long after they finish the movie. That's what they remember about the soundtrack. It's not just trying to scare you. It's trying to make you feel emotionally trapped. What makes the soundtrack even more impressive is how closely it mirrors the structure of the story itself. The obvious theme of the movie, like in its core, it's about a desire that's becoming destructive. It's about the danger of idealizing something so much that you completely stop seeing reality clearly. And the soundtrack basically acts as a emotional narrator for all that progression, all the story. At the beginning of the film, as we said, everything feels exciting, warm, bright. There's this sense of possibility, of fantasy, of escapism. And the soundtrack fully supports this emotional perspective. The music feels hopeful, dreamy, romantic. And because the soundtrack feels so sincere in the beginning, the audience get emotionally dragged or pulled into this fantasy as well. That's what makes the later part of the movie so much more devastating and why it works. Because the soundtrack slowly starts to reveal the emotional cost of obsession. As the characters lose control, the music loses its stability too. The themes start repeating in strange ways. Ambient sounds become heavier. The whole music becomes claustrophobic. And eventually the music almost feels trapped in emotional loops, like it cannot escape itself. That's a really smart way of representing obsession psychologically, because obsession itself is repetitive. You replay thoughts, memories, desires over and over again until they stop feeling comforting and starts to become destructive. And the soundtrack communicates that without needing of some words, without lyrics. It's just notes. There are also moments where the music and the scene the emotional states of those two things don't really match. And I think that's intentional. Sometimes horrible things are happening on screen, right? But the music playing in the background, it's strangely beautiful. And I think that's intentional. The soundtrack keeps pulling the audience back into this fantasy, while the realities is already becoming very disturbing. It creates this emotional conflict where you clearly understand that something is wrong, but you're still kinda drawn to it. That's honestly what makes the horror of obsession so different from a lot of other movies that came out last years. The fear isn't just coming from what's happening. It's coming from how seductive this whole experience feels. And without the soundtrack, I don't think the movie's themes would land nearly as effective. The music is the backbone of the movie, and it's what gives the emotional descent its weight. What's honestly kind of crazy is that this was Burwell's first feature score, because that soundtrack already feels incredibly confident. A lot of first-time composers try to play things safely in horror movies, so you tend to go with kind of more generic soundtrack, right? But Burwell clearly understood the emotional identity of the movie and its themes. The soundtrack never feels generic. Even when you can hear the influences from older psychological horror soundtracks, right? It still feels personal. And I think a huge reason for it is how emotionally focused the score is. It's not trying to impress you technically in every second. It's trying to create a feeling. That's much harder to do, especially in horror, where it's very easy to rely on a loud sound design instead of atmosphere that's slowly built. What's also interesting is how many people connected with the soundtrack outside the movie itself. A lot of horror scores work with the movie itself, but doesn't really stay with the audience afterward. But people started replaying those tracks on their own. As we already said, they started to compare it to older psychological horror games or horror flicks with this similar vibe to it. This usually only happens when a soundtrack creates a strong emotional identity outside of the movie. And honestly, I think that's the biggest compliment a horror soundtrack can get. Because, quite frankly, horror music is difficult. You have to create tension, atmosphere, emotion, and psychological unease all at the same time without overwhelming the person watching and hearing. And Burwell somehow managed to balance all of that while still making the soundtrack feel genuinely beautiful to listen to. The balance between beauty and discomfort is what makes the score memorable. And it will honestly be very interesting where his career goes, because he has already proven itself. He has already proven that he is a great composer, and I'm really excited to see where he has to come up with next. So, in conclusion, What makes the soundtrack of Obsession so effective is that it understands something really important about horror. The scariest emotions don't usually feel scary in the beginning. Obsession starts as something amazing, something euphoric, as a comfort, as fantasy, excitement, as a desire. And the soundtrack captures that emotional progression perfectly. It seduces you before it unsettles you, and only later reveals how destructive the fantasy really is. And by the end of the movie, the same melodies that once felt comforting now is suddenly corrupted. And it's not because the soundtrack changed completely. Your understanding of it has changed. And I think that's why the music sticks with you after the movie ends. It's because it presents the whole emotional core of the movie itself. Thanks for watching.